My husband moved his mistress into our lake house, so I locked them both outside. But what he did not know was that the house had never belonged to him. You said I didn't belong here, Aurelia murmured through the glass. So why are you the one standing outside? Dawn had not yet fully broken over Lake Crescent when Graham Whitmore punched the access code into the black keypad for the fourth time. Each attempt ended the same way. A hard red flash, a soft mechanical click, and the silence of a door refusing him. Cold rain silvered the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat. Beside him, Sloane Mercer stood barefoot on the stone terrace, clutching her pale satin heels in one hand and the front of her coat closed with the other. The champagne confidence she had worn 12 hours earlier was gone. Try the key, she said, her voice thin with disbelief. Graham shoved the brass key into the lock. It turned halfway, caught, then stopped. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, warm light spread across the oak floors and stone fireplace. Aurelia stood just beyond the door, one hand wrapped around a white coffee mug, the other resting at her side. She wore a deep emerald robe over a simple cream dress, her long black hair falling in polished waves over one shoulder. She looked rested, untouched, almost serene. That was what unsettled him most. Graham struck the glass with the flat of his palm, not hard enough to damage it, but hard enough to demand an answer. Open the door, Aurelia. She did not move. Behind her, the lake house glowed like a lantern against the blue-gray morning. Every detail inside carried her hand. The curved staircase, the walnut shelves, the hand-cut stones surrounding the fireplace. Graham had always spoken of the house as though it were proof of his success. His retreat, his reward. Yet Aurelia had chosen the land, drawn the plans, approved the beams, and paid the final construction invoice from an account he had never bothered to understand. Sloane turned toward him slowly. You told me this place was yours. Graham kept his eyes on Aurelia. It is. The lie came too quickly. Aurelia lifted the mug and took a measured sip. Her calm traveled through the glass more powerfully than shouting ever could. On the terrace, Sloane's expression shifted from confusion to humiliation. She remembered the dinner the night before, the way Graham had opened a bottle of vintage wine and told his guests they were standing in the future centerpiece of Whitmore Retreats. She remembered slipping into Aurelia's silk housecoat and laughing when Graham said his wife would be gone by morning. Now the security panel beside the door displayed a single line in clean white letters. Access revoked by owner. Graham read it twice. Then a dark SUV rolled quietly up the gravel drive and stopped beside his car. A man in a navy overcoat stepped out carrying a leather document case. Darius Bellamy did not hurry. He climbed the terrace steps, nodded once to Aurelia through the glass, and faced Graham with the composed expression of someone arriving exactly when expected. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I'm here on behalf of the property owner. For the first time that morning, Graham stopped demanding entry. Inside, Aurelia set down her coffee and placed a small wooden box on the table beside her. The brass clasp caught the first clean ray of sunrise. 12 hours earlier, Graham had told her she was no longer his wife and had no place in his house. He had smiled when he said it. He had no idea she had spent the night deciding how politely to return the favor. 12 hours earlier, the lake had been black beneath the moon, its surface smooth enough to reflect every warm window of the house Aurelia had once believed would protect her marriage. She turned onto the private drive shortly after 7 in the evening, guided by the security alert glowing on her phone. Guest access had been used at 6:43. Graham had not mentioned coming to the property, and no contractor had been scheduled. Then she saw Sloane Mercer's silver convertible parked inside the cedar garage, occupying the space beneath the small brass plaque that still read Aurelia. For several seconds, she remained behind the wheel with both hands resting on the leather. Rain traced crooked paths across the windshield. Her heartbeat was steady, but each breath felt carefully measured, as though her body already understood what her mind was still refusing to name. She stepped from the car and crossed the wet stone path without an umbrella. Through the front windows, candlelight flickered over the dining room. For figures sat around the walnut table her mother had commissioned 30 years earlier. Graham occupied the head, laughing with 2 investors Aurelia recognized from Whitmore Development. Sloane sat at his right hand wearing Aurelia's ivory silk housecoat, the sleeves folded back carelessly at her wrists. A bottle of red wine stood open between them. Aurelia unlocked the side entrance with her fingerprint. The conversation stopped when she entered the kitchen. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of her camel coat, and a drop slid from one polished wave of black hair to her collarbone. Nobody greeted her. Graham lowered his glass with visible irritation, as if she had interrupted a meeting instead of entered her own home. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Aurelia looked toward Sloane, then toward the place settings arranged on her grandmother's china. "The security system notified me." Sloane tightened the housecoat around herself, but she did not stand. One of the investors studied his plate. The other reached for water he did not drink. Graham rose and smoothed the front of his navy sweater. "This is not the time." "For what?" Aurelia asked quietly. His jaw stiffened. On the counter behind him sat architectural renderings stamped with the Whitmore Retreats logo. The central image showed the lake house surrounded by luxury cabins that did not exist. Aurelia recognized her original drawings beneath the company branding. Graham followed her gaze and stepped between her and the plans. "We are discussing a private development opportunity. On my property." The question was soft enough to make the silence heavier. Sloane gave a small laugh that sounded rehearsed. Graham did not. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and removed a thick cream envelope. He placed it on the table where Aurelia's dinner plate should have been. "I was going to speak with you tomorrow," he said. "But since you came here, we can settle this now." Aurelia touched the envelope without opening it. The return address belonged to a downtown divorce firm. Across the table, Sloane lifted Graham's wine glass and took a slow sip. That small act told Aurelia more than any confession could have. Graham glanced toward his guests, drawing confidence from their presence. "I filed this morning," he said. "You should collect whatever personal items you need tonight. Sloane and I will be using the house from now on." Outside, rain tapped against the glass in 1,000 patient fingers. Aurelia raised her eyes to the man she had supported for 14 years. He mistook her stillness for defeat, just as he had mistaken her silence for weakness. He had forgotten that this house had been designed to withstand storms. Sloane was the first to recover. She set the wine glass down beside Aurelia's unopened envelope and rose with the confidence of someone who believed the room had already chosen her. The ivory housecoat shifted over a fitted black dress, elegant enough for dinner and careless enough to make the insult unmistakable. "I did not realize you were coming," she said, smoothing one sleeve as though the fabric belonged to her. Aurelia's eyes rested on the monogram near the cuff, two small embroidered letters her mother had added by hand years ago. She remembered wearing that robe the morning the foundation was poured, standing barefoot on unfinished oak while Graham complained about the mud on his shoes. "Neither did I," Aurelia replied. Sloane smiled, but the expression did not reach her eyes. She moved toward the living room, trailing her fingers over the back of a cream linen sofa. "The house is beautiful. Graham has been telling me how much potential it has." Potential. The word landed strangely in a place already complete. Aurelia watched Sloane inspect the room as if evaluating a purchase. She paused beside the fireplace, lifted a framed photograph of Aurelia and her mother from the mantel, then returned it slightly off-center. "I was thinking the room could use something brighter," Sloane said. "Maybe less wood. More glass. A cleaner look." One investor cleared his throat and quietly gathered his papers. Graham gave him a warning glance. "We are not finished." "Actually," the man said, fastening his coat, "I think we have enough for tonight." His colleague followed, avoiding Aurelia's gaze as they offered brief goodbyes and left through the front entrance. The door closed behind them, taking the last pretense of business with it. Graham's expression hardened. "You embarrassed me." Aurelia looked toward the abandoned renderings on the counter. "I walked into my kitchen." Sloane folded her arms. "This does not have to become unpleasant." "It already is," Aurelia said. Her voice remained level, and that calm seemed to disturb Sloane more than anger would have. Sloane turned away and climbed 3 steps toward the upper floor. "I put my things in the main bedroom," she announced. "Graham said you barely stay here anymore." Aurelia felt the old instinct to explain, to defend the nights spent at project sites and the weekends sacrificed to rescue Graham's company from deadlines he had ignored. She let the instinct pass. Graham stepped closer, lowering his voice as if authority depended on volume. "You have the condo in the city. Take your clothes, take your jewelry, take whatever belongs to you, and leave this place alone." Aurelia studied his face. 14 years had taught her every signal. The tightened mouth, the restless hand at his watch, the slight lift of his chin when he was performing certainty. He was not calm. He was afraid of losing control in front of Sloane. What exactly did you tell her? Aurelia asked. Graham's eyes narrowed. That is none of your concern. From upstairs came the sound of a closet door opening. Then another. Sloane was moving through Aurelia's bedroom, touching her dresses, her books, the cedar chest that held her mother's letters. Aurelia removed her coat and placed it carefully over a chair. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. You brought her into my home, she said. You placed my work in front of investors. You handed me divorce papers at my mother's table. I think I have earned one honest answer. Graham exhaled and looked toward the stairs. I told her the truth. This marriage has been over for years. Aurelia glanced at the envelope again. The room seemed to contract around it. And the house? She asked. Graham gave a short, humorless laugh. The house stays with me. For the first time that evening, Aurelia almost smiled. Graham said it with the careless certainty of a man who had never been required to prove ownership of anything he enjoyed. The house stays with me. The words settled between them, heavier than the rain against the windows. Aurelia looked at him for a long moment, not because she doubted what she had heard, but because she wanted to remember the exact shape of his confidence before it disappeared. Sloane returned from upstairs carrying a small velvet jewelry case Aurelia recognized from the dresser. This was sitting out, she said, holding it between two fingers. I assumed it was not important. Aurelia crossed the room and took it from her without touching her hand. Inside lay a pair of pearl earrings Celestine had worn on the bench during her final year as a judge. Aurelia closed the case and slipped it into her coat pocket. Do not touch anything else that belonged to my mother. Sloane's expression tightened. Graham said we would be renovating. Graham says many things. The response was quiet, almost gentle, but it stripped the room of warmth. Graham moved toward the table and opened the divorce envelope himself. You are making this harder than it needs to be, he said. He removed the papers and turned them toward her, tapping the signature line with one finger. The filing is already in motion. The condo will be available to you for 60 days. After that, you can make other arrangements. Aurelia looked down at the documents. The proposal listed the city condo, 2 investment accounts, and a vehicle. The lake property was described as a marital residence to be retained by Graham. He had written her out of the home in black ink and legal language, certain that confidence could substitute for fact. Your attorney prepared this? She asked. One of the best in the state. Did you tell him how the property was acquired? Graham's mouth hardened. I told him what mattered. Sloane leaned against the dining table, impatient now. Aurelia, the marriage is over. Keeping a house you barely use would only be emotional. The red wine stain near her hand had spread into the grain of Celestine's table, dark as a bruise. Aurelia took a linen napkin, pressed it gently over the spill, and watched the fabric absorb what it could. You have known my husband for 11 months, she said. Do not explain my home to me. Sloane's cheeks colored. Graham stepped between them, reclaiming the center of the room. Enough. You are not my wife anymore, Aurelia. Stop acting like this house belongs to you. The sentence arrived exactly as he intended, sharpened for an audience of one. He expected tears, perhaps anger, perhaps the familiar silence he had always mistaken for surrender. Instead, Aurelia lifted her gaze to his. Something in her face had changed. The hurt remained, but it had moved farther away, behind a door he could no longer open. She folded the unsigned papers once and placed them back inside the envelope. Are you certain? She asked. Graham gave a short laugh. About the divorce? About ending every privilege you believe this marriage gives you. Sloane glanced at him, but Graham did not notice. He was already smiling. Absolutely. Aurelia nodded as if he had answered a routine question. Then she walked past them toward the study. Behind a framed photograph of Celestine hung a narrow wall safe Graham had never learned to open. Aurelia entered the code, removed a small walnut box, and closed the steel door with a soft click. When she returned, Graham was pouring another glass of wine. Where are you going? He asked. She slipped on her coat and held the box against her side. To make other arrangements. Sloane smiled with visible relief. Graham raised his glass, satisfied that the evening had finally returned to his control. Aurelia paused at the entrance and looked back at the warm rooms, the original drawings on the counter, and the two people already behaving as though they had inherited her life. "Enjoy the house tonight," she said. Graham did not hear the warning. He only heard permission. The rain had softened to a silver mist by the time Aurelia reached her car. She placed the walnut box on the passenger seat with both hands, as carefully as if it contained something alive. For a moment, she remained beneath the covered entry, listening to the muted laughter behind the door. Graham had already turned the music back on. Through the glass, Sloane lifted her wine and leaned against the counter as though the interruption had ended exactly as planned. Aurelia stepped into the rain without looking back. The drive into town took 22 minutes along a narrow road bordered by dark pines and low stone walls. Her headlights swept across wet pavement, empty mailboxes, and the occasional deer standing motionless near the shoulder. Inside the car, the silence felt larger than the night. She did not cry. The tears had come months earlier, in private places Graham never noticed. In the parking garage after finding a hotel receipt, in the guest bathroom after hearing him take a call from Sloane, in the middle of a grocery store when an old love song began playing overhead. Tonight, there was only clarity. At a stop sign near the lake road, Aurelia opened the glove compartment and removed a small black notebook. She turned to a page marked with a blue ribbon. 3 names were written there. Darius Bellamy was the first. She called him at 8:36. He answered on the second ring. "Aurelia?" His voice was alert despite the hour. "I need you to open the Vaughn Trust file." There was a brief pause. Did something happen? She looked toward the walnut box beside her. Graham filed for divorce this morning. He moved Sloane into the lake house tonight. Darius did not react with surprise. That restraint was one of the reasons she trusted him. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Do they still have access to the property?" "For now." Another pause followed, this one measured and legal. "Do you want me to prepare a temporary access restriction?" Aurelia watched rain gather along the windshield. "I want every permission reviewed. The gate code, the smart locks, the garage entry, the security account, and the digital guest list." "That can be done. I also want formal notice sent to Whitmore Development. They are using images of the house in an investment proposal." Darius exhaled slowly. "That changes the situation." "I know." She closed the notebook. "Can you meet me tonight?" His answer came without hesitation. "My office in 40 minutes. Aurelia ended the call and continued toward town. The law offices of Bellamy and Shaw occupied the second floor of a restored brick building above a quiet pharmacy. One light burned behind the tall windows when she arrived. Darius met her at the door in a navy sweater and pressed slacks, his silver-framed glasses low on his nose. He did not offer pity. He simply took her wet coat, handed her a towel, and led her into the conference room. Aurelia placed the walnut box on the polished table. Inside were the original trust documents, the property deed, construction payment records, and the agreement Graham had signed 14 years earlier acknowledging that the lake land and every permanent structure built upon it remained Aurelia's separate property. Darius read the pages in silence. Then he looked up. He truly believes the house belongs to him. Aurelia remembered the certainty in Graham's voice, the way he had raised his glass after she left. "Yes," she said. "And tonight, he made sure I understood that I was no longer his wife." Darius folded his hands. "What do you want to do?" Aurelia looked at the clock. It was 9:18. She pictured Graham asleep beneath her mother's roof, certain the morning would confirm his victory. "He gave me until sunrise," she said. "I would like to honor his deadline." Before Graham learned to speak with the confidence of a man who owned rooms, he had once stood in Aurelia's studio with rain on his shoulders and fear in his eyes. He was 32 then, working out of a borrowed office above a dry cleaner, carrying more debt than he admitted, and a folder filled with development plans no bank wanted to finance. Aurelia was already building a name for herself. Her designs appeared in regional architecture magazines, and clients waited months for her attention because she understood how to make a house feel permanent without making it feel cold. Graham had admired that quality at first. He used to sit on the edge of her drafting table after midnight, watching her move a pencil across, tracing paper while the city glowed beyond the windows. "You see things before they exist," he told her once. She had believed he meant it as love. When his first hotel proposal was rejected, Aurelia introduced him to one of her clients, a retired developer named Malcolm Reed, who respected her judgment. Malcolm agreed to review Graham's numbers because Aurelia asked him to. When the project finally received financing, Graham called it his breakthrough. Aurelia did not correct him. She revised the site plan without charging a fee, attended meetings when investors questioned the design, and used her professional reputation to reassure people who did not yet trust his. At public events, Graham placed a hand at the small of her back and introduced her as the brilliant architect who had saved the project. Years later, the introduction shortened. First she became my wife, the architect, then simply my wife. The change happened gradually enough to feel harmless. Graham began asking her to decline projects that required travel because important clients expected them to entertain. He suggested she move her studio closer to his office so their schedules would be easier to manage. When she received an offer to lead a waterfront restoration in Baltimore, he called the timing selfish. Whitmore Development was expanding, he reminded her. They needed stability. Aurelia turned down the job. She told herself marriage required seasons of sacrifice. Graham never used that word for what he gave up, because he gave up very little. His company grew. His suits became more expensive. His opinions became louder. At dinners, he repeated ideas Aurelia had shared with him in private and accepted praise without looking in her direction. When she corrected a structural assumption during one meeting, he smiled tightly and told the room she had always been overly cautious. Everyone laughed because Graham did. Aurelia did not. The lake house came during the final year of her mother's life. Celestine Vaughn had owned the wooded parcel for decades, 12 acres of pine and stone overlooking nearly half a mile of water. She wanted Aurelia to design something that belonged to no client and answered to no trend. Build the place you would run to, Celestine had said. Aurelia drew the plans at her mother's kitchen table. Graham appeared interested only after the foundation was complete and friends began praising the view. He started calling it our lake house before the roof was installed. Aurelia let him. She had spent years confusing generosity with safety. Sitting across from Darius in the quiet conference room, she realized Graham had mistaken every door she opened for proof that the building belonged to him. Darius turned another page in the trust file. You protected this property from the beginning, he said. Aurelia looked at Celestine's signature, steady and unmistakable beneath the legal seal. My mother protected it, she replied. She must have known something I did not. Darius removed his glasses and studied her. Perhaps she knew exactly who you were, even when you forgot. Outside the office windows, the rain began to lift. Aurelia rested her fingertips on the deed and remembered the woman she had been before Graham needed her smaller. That woman had not disappeared. She had only been waiting for someone to call her by her full name. The trust had been created 16 years earlier, long before Graham began treating Aurelia's patients as permission. Celestine had summoned them both to her attorney's office on a bright April morning and placed a single document between them. The lake property, she explained, would pass directly to Aurelia and remain separate from any present or future marital estate. Graham had barely looked at the pages. He had been answering messages beneath the table, irritated that the meeting interfered with a financing call. When the attorney asked him to acknowledge the arrangement, he signed where he was shown and joked that Aurelia could keep the trees as long as he got a boat slip. Celestine had not laughed. She watched him cap the pen, then turned to her daughter with a look Aurelia understood only now. It was not suspicion. It was preparation. Darius placed the acknowledgement agreement beside the deed and traced one paragraph with his finger. The language was plain. Graham had waived any claim to the land, the residence, and all permanent improvements financed through the Vaughn Trust. This was notarized before construction began, Darius said. There is no ambiguity. Aurelia remembered the day clearly. Graham had left the attorney's office before she did, already speaking into his phone as the elevator doors closed. Celestine remained at the conference table, her hands folded over the head of her cane. A person who loves you should not require access to everything you own, she had said. Aurelia had pushed back then, gently but firmly. Graham was her husband. Marriage was not a negotiation conducted behind locked doors. Celestine had listened without argument. No, she said, but love and entitlement are not the same thing. At the time, Aurelia thought the warning belonged to an older generation, shaped by caution and hard-earned independence. Now, sitting beneath the low office lights, she felt the full weight of it. Her mother had spent 30 years in courtrooms watching people discover too late that trust did not replace documentation. She had protected Aurelia without humiliating her, preserving a door back to herself in case the marriage ever became a room without air. Darius opened a second folder containing construction records. Every major payment had come from the trust. The stonework, the windows, the custom millwork, the geothermal system, even the private road had been paid without using Graham's income or company funds. He had contributed furniture, a speedboat, and several expensive appliances, items that could be removed without altering the property itself. He can claim personal belongings, Darius said. He cannot claim the house. Aurelia looked at the invoice for the walnut dining table. Celestine had ordered it 6 months before she died. At the bottom, in blue ink, her mother had written a note to the craftsman. Make it strong enough to outlast bad decisions. Aurelia pressed her lips together, not to stop tears, but to contain the sudden warmth moving through her chest. Her mother had seen strength in her long before Aurelia learned how to use it. What about access? She asked. Darius turned to the property management agreement. Graham's name appeared only as an authorized family guest, added by Aurelia 3 years after the wedding. The authorization could be revoked at any time by the trust beneficiary. You are not evicting an owner, Darius said. You are withdrawing permission from a guest. The distinction was so simple that Aurelia almost laughed. For years, Graham had moved through the lake house with the confidence of a king. He chose the wine, invited clients, rearranged weekends, and spoke about future renovations as if the walls answered to him. Yet legally, he had never been more than someone Aurelia allowed through the gate. Darius placed the authorization form in front of her. Once you sign this, his access ends. Aurelia picked up the pen. For a brief second, she heard Graham's voice from earlier, telling her she had no place there. Then she signed her full name in the space reserved for the owner. The signature had barely dried when Darius asked Aurelia to show him the materials she had seen on Graham's kitchen counter. She unlocked her phone and opened the photographs she had taken before leaving the lake house. The images were not dramatic. There were no secret messages, no intimate photographs, no confession written in careless words. What they revealed was colder. Graham had turned her home into a promise he was selling to strangers. The cover page displayed an aerial photograph of the property beneath the name Whitmore Retreats. Below it, in polished gold lettering, appeared the phrase "A Private Legacy on Lake Crescent." Darius enlarged the image and adjusted his glasses. Did you authorize this? Aurelia shook her head. I had never seen it before tonight. The next page showed her original architectural drawings stripped of her name and marked as proprietary concepts owned by Whitmore Development. New guest cottages had been placed along the shoreline. A wellness pavilion covered the meadow where Celestine used to sit beneath an old sycamore tree. The private road had been widened. The dock had been extended for corporate events. Graham had not merely imagined a future for the property. He had presented that future to investors as though he had the legal right to deliver it. Aurelia felt something inside her grow still. The affair had wounded her, but this was different. Sloane had entered her marriage through Graham's vanity. The development plan had entered through calculation. He had studied the places Aurelia loved, measured their value, and decided her memories were available for conversion into profit. There is more, she said. She opened an email she had forwarded to herself 2 weeks earlier after finding it printed beside Graham's home office printer. The subject line read Lake Crescent Collateral Structure. In the message, Graham told his chief financial officer that the property would serve as the flagship asset supporting the first round of investment. He described ownership as a family technicality that would be resolved during restructuring. Darius read the sentence twice. He knew the title was not in his name. Yes, and he intended to use the divorce to pressure you into transferring it. Aurelia looked toward the rain-dimmed windows. For months, Graham had complained that she was emotionally attached to a house they barely used. He had suggested selling it, then leasing it to his company, then placing it into a shared holding entity for tax efficiency. Each time, she had refused. He had called her sentimental. Now she understood why every conversation had ended with anger. The house was not simply part of the divorce. It was the reason he wanted the divorce settled quickly. Darius printed the email and placed it beside the trust documents. This could expose him to claims of material misrepresentation if investors relied on it. Aurelia did not answer immediately. She remembered Graham standing at Celestine's table, telling her the house would remain with him. He had not been speaking from ignorance. He had been speaking from a plan. Sloane's presence had only made him careless enough to reveal it too soon. Can the investors be notified without making this public? Aurelia asked. Darius nodded. We can send a formal cease and desist to the company, its counsel, and any party identified in the materials. We can state that the property is privately owned, unavailable for development, and has never been pledged as collateral. Do it tonight. Graham may accuse you of trying to destroy his company. Aurelia folded her hands on the table. I am not destroying anything. I am preventing him from selling what was never his. Darius studied her for a moment, then began drafting. As the printer came to life, Aurelia noticed a final detail in the presentation photograph. The image had been taken from the lake, showing the house glowing at sunset. Graham had cropped out the small brass plaque near the entrance, the one Celestine installed before moving in the first piece of furniture. Bon house. He could remove the name from a photograph. By morning, he would learn he could not remove it from the deed. By 10:15 that night, the conference table had become a map of everything Graham believed he controlled and everything the law said otherwise. Darius worked through each document with patient precision. First came the revocation of Graham's access to the property. Then the formal notice prohibiting Whitmore Development from using the lake house, its image, or Aurelia's architectural plans in any investment material. Finally, Darius prepared a preservation letter requiring the company to retain every email, presentation, financial projection, and internal message connected to the proposed resort. Aurelia read each page before signing. She did not rush. Graham had relied on her exhaustion for years, presenting decisions after long days and asking for immediate trust. Tonight, every sentence received her full attention. The security company can update the system remotely, Darius said. The gate, garage, and exterior doors will change at 5:30 in the morning. A technician will arrive shortly afterward to replace the mechanical cylinders. Aurelia looked at the clock. Why 5:30? You said sunrise. Sunrise is at 6:12. Darius understood. Then 5:45. That gives the technician time before the road becomes busy. Aurelia nodded. Graham had always admired deadlines when they belonged to other people. She wondered whether he would recognize one when it closed a door in front of him. Darius sent the notices through secure electronic delivery, with copies to Graham's corporate counsel, chief financial officer, and the two investors who had attended dinner. Confirmation receipts appeared one by one across his screen. At 10:42, the first response arrived from the company's outside attorney requesting an immediate call. At 10:47, one investor opened every attachment. At 10:51, Graham's chief financial officer downloaded the property deed twice. The quiet conference room filled with consequences no one had yet spoken aloud. Aurelia opened the walnut box again and removed a brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. It had once belonged to Celestine. The modern locks no longer required it, but Aurelia had kept it as a reminder of the first day they entered the finished house together. Celestine had stood in the empty living room, looked across the lake, and said, "Peace needs boundaries, too." Aurelia had smiled then, thinking her mother was speaking about architecture. Now she understood the sentence had never been about walls. Darius placed a final form before her. It authorized a licensed property service to inventory Graham's personal belongings and move them into weather-protected containers near the covered motor court. Nothing would be damaged. Nothing would be discarded. His clothing, golf clubs, office files, wine collection, and the framed business awards he had arranged along Aurelia's study shelves would be handled carefully and documented. This keeps the process clean, Darius said. He cannot claim you acted recklessly. Good. Aurelia signed. I do not want revenge confused with disorder. At 11:20, she reserved a room at a small inn near the lake. She could have returned to the city, but she wanted to be present when the property changed hands in practice, not only on paper. Before leaving the office, she sent Graham one message. She did not mention the deed, the trust, or the notices already moving through his company. She wrote only, "You were right. Our marriage no longer gives either of us privileges that do not legally exist." Graham read the message at 11:28. He did not respond. Instead, the security log showed him leaving the lake house with Sloane shortly before midnight. likely for the hotel bar where he often took clients after dinner. Aurelia watched the timestamp appear on her phone and closed the application. He believed he was stepping out for a drink. He did not know he had just left the house for the final time. At 5:43 in the morning, the security panel at Vaughn House changed from green to amber, then to red. The shift lasted less than 3 seconds. Inside the quiet property, the smart locks reset, the garage permissions cleared, and every temporary access code connected to Graham Whitmore expired. At 5:52, a licensed technician arrived in a white service van and replaced the exterior cylinders beneath the covered entry. Aurelia watched from the kitchen while coffee brewed behind her, the soft mechanical sounds carrying through the still house. Nothing about the process felt dramatic. That was what made it final. By 6:10, the rain had thinned to mist. The lake lay beneath a pale blue sky, smooth and silent beyond the windows. Aurelia changed into a cream dress and wrapped herself in a deep emerald robe. She opened the curtains, lit the fireplace, and returned Celestine's pearl earrings to the velvet case upstairs. Sloane's clothing had already been folded into a garment bag by the property service. Graham's belongings had been cataloged, boxed, and placed beneath the covered motor court, each container labeled in neat black letters. The wine stain on Celestine's table remained faintly visible, but Aurelia left it untouched. Some marks did not need to be erased immediately. They only needed to stop spreading. At 6:27, headlights appeared between the pines. Graham's sedan moved too quickly along the gravel drive before stopping near the front terrace. Sloane stepped out first, carrying her heels and looking tired beneath the sharp morning light. Graham followed, fastening his coat as he approached the door. He entered the code without hesitation. The panel flashed red. He frowned and tried again. Red. On the third attempt, he slowed his fingers, as though precision could restore authority. The lock remained silent. Sloane glanced toward the garage, used the remote. Graham pressed the button on his key fob. Nothing moved. The battery must be dead. He reached for the brass key and forced it halfway into the cylinder before realizing the lock had been changed. Through the glass, Aurelia lifted her coffee mug. Graham saw her and stepped closer. Opened the door. She remained where she was. His expression shifted from confusion to offense, then to the controlled anger he used whenever the world failed to recognize his version of events. He pressed his palm against the glass. Aurelia, this is ridiculous. Sloane moved beside him and peered inside. Her gaze landed on the garment bag and labeled boxes beneath the motor court. Those are our things. Aurelia nodded once. Graham struck the doorbell. The chimes sounded softly through the house. He pressed it again and held it down until the system ended the signal automatically. Aurelia set her mug on the table and walked toward the entrance. She stopped several feet from the glass, close enough for them to see her face clearly. You changed the locks, Graham said. I changed the permissions. You cannot do this to me. The owner can revoke guest access. The word guest seemed to confuse him more than any accusation could have. Sloane turned toward Graham. You said you own this place. I do. His reply came fast, almost reflexive. Aurelia looked at the security panel beside the door. Clean white letters glowed against the dark screen. Access revoked by owner. Sloane read them slowly. When she looked back at Graham, disbelief had replaced exhaustion. Then why does it not recognize you? Before he could answer, a dark sport utility vehicle rolled through the gate and came to a quiet stop beside his sedan. Darius Bellamy stepped out carrying a leather document case. He buttoned his navy overcoat as he approached the terrace, unhurried beneath the lifting mist. Aurelia opened the interior vestibule door, but left the locked glass barrier between them. Darius nodded to her, then faced Graham. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore, he said. I am here on behalf of the property owner. Graham looked from Darius to Aurelia, and for the first time since arriving, he said nothing. Darius placed the leather document case on the hood of his vehicle and opened it with deliberate care. Graham watched every movement, his face arranged into the expression he used during difficult negotiations, calm enough to suggest control, tight enough to reveal the effort behind it. Whatever she told you, this is a marital residence, he said. My attorney will confirm that. Darius removed a certified copy of the property deed and held it where Graham could see the county seal. Your attorney may confirm anything supported by the record. The record shows that this land was transferred to the Celestine Vaughn Trust 16 years ago, and later vested solely in Aaliyah Vaughn as beneficiary. Graham glanced at the first page, then away. We built the house together. The construction records show otherwise. Darius produced a second file. Every permanent improvement was paid through the trust. The foundation, framing, roofing, stonework, utilities, and road were funded without marital assets. Sloane moved closer, her coat drawn tightly around her. She looked from the papers to the house beyond the glass, as though the building itself had changed shape. Graham gave a dismissive laugh. I paid for half the furnishings. I maintained this place for years. You purchased removable personal property, Darius replied. Those items have been inventoried and are available under the motor court. Maintenance does not create ownership. Graham's eyes found the labeled containers. His name appeared on every box, neat and impersonal. This is unlawful, he said. I live here. Darius turned to another document. You were granted family guest access by the owner. That authorization was revoked at 5:45 this morning. I am her husband. The words came louder now, stripped of polish. Through the glass, Aaliyah remained still. She had heard him use that title as a shield in restaurants, offices, and private conversations, always when it benefited him. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had declared the title meaningless. Darius adjusted his glasses. You served her with divorce papers and expressly stated that the marriage no longer provided her with rights to this property. Mrs. Vaughn has chosen to accept the legal separation of privileges immediately. Graham looked at Aaliyah. You planned this. She opened the interior speaker beside the door. Her voice emerged clear and even. You planned to use my home as collateral. Sloane's head turned sharply. Graham did not answer. Darius removed the investment presentation and placed it on top of the deed. The image of Vaughn House gleamed beneath the Whitmore Retreats logo. Formal notice was delivered last night to your company counsel, chief financial officer, and prospective investors. The property has never been available for development, transfer, or collateralization. Graham's face lost color. You contacted them? I corrected the ownership record, Aaliyah said. A county sheriff's vehicle appeared at the gate and approached at a measured speed. Graham seemed almost relieved when Deputy Sheriff Lenora Hayes stepped onto the terrace. But the relief vanished after she reviewed Darius's documents and compared them with the record on her tablet. Mr. Whitmore, she said, the deed identifies Ms. Vaughn as the sole owner. You have been formally notified that your permission to enter has ended. Graham gestured toward the house. My clothes are inside. Your property has been packed and documented. You may collect it from the covered area without entering the residence. Sloane stared at him, humiliation settling over her features with quiet precision. Last night you told those investors this land belonged to your company. Graham kept his eyes on Aaliyah. This is still part of the divorce. Darius handed him the acknowledgement agreement bearing his own signature. You waived every claim before construction began. Graham read the page. His gaze stopped at the notarized line, then at the date beside his name. The confidence drained from his posture one careful inch at a time. Inside the house, morning light moved across Celestine's walnut table and reached Aurelia's feet. Every page outside carried her name. The only page carrying Graham's proved that he had never owned the door he was demanding she open. Graham's phone began vibrating. Before Deputy Hayes finished speaking, he ignored the first call, then the second, but the third displayed the name of Whitmore Development's chief financial officer. Sloane saw it before he turned the screen away. Answer it, she said. Her voice no longer carried the polished confidence from dinner. It sounded thin, almost cautious. Graham stepped several feet from the terrace and accepted the call. Not now, Peter. The voice on the other end was loud enough to carry through the cold morning air. The investors had suspended negotiations. Corporate counsel wanted an emergency meeting. The board had requested every document connected to Lake Crescent, and the bank was reviewing whether Graham had represented the property as an available asset during previous financing discussions. Graham lowered his voice, but the damage was already visible in the way his shoulders tightened. This is a misunderstanding, he said. I can resolve it. Peter's reply lasted less than 10 seconds. Then the call ended. Graham stared at the dark screen as though it had betrayed him. Another message appeared immediately, followed by several more. Each notification seemed to remove a layer of certainty from his face. Sloane looked toward the presentation Darius had placed on the vehicle. You said the funding was secured. Graham slipped the phone into his coat pocket. It will be. You said this property was the centerpiece. It was going to be. The change in tints hung between them. Sloane's eyes narrowed. Did you know it was hers? Graham glanced toward Aurelia and did not answer. That silence told Sloane everything. She slowly removed the diamond ring he had given her 3 weeks earlier, the one she had displayed at dinner as proof of a future already promised. She placed it on the hood of his sedan. You did not bring me here because you had one, she said. You brought me here because you needed everyone to believe you had. Graham's expression hardened. Do not make this about you. Sloane gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. You made everything about an image. She collected her garment bag from beneath the motor court, called for a car, and walked toward the end of the drive without looking back. Graham watched her go, but he did not follow. The morning had stripped away his audience, his property, and the woman who had mistaken borrowed access for wealth. Darius handed him an inventory sheet and a pen. Please verify the listed items before collection. Graham did not take them. His gaze remained fixed on Aurelia through the glass. You wanted to humiliate me. Aurelia activated the speaker again. No, I wanted my property protected. You contacted my investors in the middle of the night. Because you offered them something you did not own. You knew what that would do to the company. Aurelia looked past him toward the lake, where the mist was beginning to lift from the water. You knew what your plan would do to me. Graham opened his mouth, but no answer came. Deputy Hayes reminded him that he could collect the boxes or arrange for a moving service. After several seconds, he signed the inventory sheet. One by one, the containers were loaded into his vehicle. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been thrown into the rain. Even his framed awards were wrapped in clean paper. Aurelia had left him no disorder to accuse her of creating. When the final box was secured, Graham stood at the foot of the terrace and looked at the house as though seeing it for the first time. After everything I built, he said quietly, you are taking it all away. Aurelia rested one hand on Celestine's table. I am taking back what you kept calling yours. She turned off the speaker before he could respond. Outside, Graham remained beside his car, surrounded by the possessions he could prove belonged to him. Inside, Aurelia opened the curtains wider and let the morning light enter every room he had tried to claim. 1 year later, Vaughn House no longer felt like a monument to what Aurelia had survived. It felt alive. On an early October morning, sunlight spilled across the lake and warmed the long walnut table where 6 women sat with sketchbooks, laptops, and coffee cups arranged between them. They were architects, designers, engineers, and small business owners, each rebuilding a career after divorce, financial control, or years spent making themselves smaller for someone else. Aurelia moved among them in a soft navy dress, listening more than she spoke. She had transformed the property into the Celestine Residency, a 12-week program offering workspace, professional mentoring, and a quiet place for Black women to begin again without apology. The guest rooms Graham once planned to turn into corporate suites now held drafting tables and shelves of design books. The meadow remained untouched. The old sycamore still stood near the water, its leaves turning copper in the cool breeze. Near the entrance, the brass plaque had been cleaned and restored. Vaughn House. Nothing more was needed. Aurelia paused beside a young landscape architect named Nia, who was presenting her first independent proposal to the group. Nia's hands trembled as she unfolded the plans, but her voice grew steadier with each sentence. When she finished, the room filled with thoughtful questions and warm approval. Aurelia saw something familiar in her face, the fragile surprise of a woman discovering that her ideas could occupy space without permission. Do not shrink the entrance, Aurelia told her gently. You designed it wide for a reason. Nia looked down at the drawing, then smiled. I thought it might be too much. It is only too much for people who expected less from you. Later that afternoon, after the residents left for a walk along the shoreline, Aurelia remained alone at Celestine's table. The wine stain from that final dinner had faded into the wood, visible only when the light struck it from a certain angle. She had chosen not to refinish the surface. The mark no longer represented Sloane or Graham. It was simply proof that something could be damaged without losing its strength. Her phone lit beside a stack of grant applications. Graham's name appeared for the first time in nearly 6 months. Whitmore Development had survived, but not in the form he once imagined. The board removed him as chief executive after the investigation revealed other exaggerated claims in investor materials. Sloan moved to another city. The divorce concluded quietly, and Aurelia kept every asset the trust had protected. Graham's message contained only one sentence. "I never knew what you were capable of." Aurelia read it once. There had been a time when those words would have pleased her, when recognition from him felt like proof that she mattered. Now they sounded almost childish. He had known what she was capable of. He had watched her design buildings, rescue projects, open doors, and carry his ambitions through rooms he could not enter alone. He had simply believed her strength would always remain available to him. Aurelia turned the phone face down without replying. Outside, laughter drifted from the path near the lake. She rose and opened the glass doors, allowing the autumn air to move through the house. On the table behind her, a small bronze inscription caught the afternoon light. "Nothing reclaimed with dignity is revenge." Aurelia stepped onto the terrace as the women returned beneath the gold and red trees. The house did not feel silent anymore. It felt peaceful, and she finally understood the difference.